Good afternoon, everybody. Harassment and bullying of public servants in the workplace is a matter that this government takes very, very seriously and has since we came to government 5 years ago. On Friday, we saw Manitoba's official opposition demonstrate it does not share that attitude. For the past 6 months, a Manitoba public servant named Paul Beauregard has been the subject of repeated bullying and harassment actions through false allegations made against him of conflict of interest and wrongdoing by an NDP member of our legislature. In this, he has been aided and abetted by the leader of the official opposition. On Friday, an arm's-length, nonpartisan investigation conducted by an independent investigator on behalf of the entire Legislative Assembly found that the NDP member for the area of St. James had participated in a serious breach of the respectful workplace policy of the Legislative Assembly of Manitoba on a repeated basis. I think at this point in time it's important to understand that these policies were developed with the agreement and support of all political parties in our Legislative Assembly, and they were designed to be nonpartisan. And they were designed that way because we believed at the time, and we still do on the government side, that every employee is entitled to work in an environment that is respectful and free of all forms of harassment. We agree. Unfortunately, it appears that the opposition leader does not. Now, these policies apply to all members of the Legislative Assembly, without exception, and they explicitly cover their interactions with public servants as well. I want to say to every public servant today, this government and I personally will defend and support you against bullying and against harassment of any kind at any time. Every spouse, partner, parent, family member of a public servant needs to know this, and they need to know that we will protect their loved ones from disrespectful and harmful behavior in the workplace. I want our government employees and their families to know that we have their back. The respectful workplace policy was agreed to by all parties 2 years ago, and it has been applied previously to censure 3 members of the Legislative Assembly. The Code of Conduct investigation concerning Mr. Beauregard was an independent investigation. The processes that were followed were determined by the Legislative Assembly of Manitoba under their own rules as set out by the Speaker. And that is why it should be most disturbing to every Manitoban that the leader of the NDP and the member for St. James have sought to trivialize this code of conduct itself, and they have sought to politicize the legislature's independent process. In so doing, they attempt to discredit a policy that seeks to hold people accountable for their actions. And it saddens me to see the NDP leader in our province politicize this independent investigation by the Legislative Assembly by calling it, quote, frivolous and, quote, rigged. These comments are an attack against every MLA, against the legislature itself, and against the very important principle that everyone has the right to a safe workplace free from harassment and bullying. Mr. Canu appears to want a structure that would leave NDP MLAs somehow in a separate class above the rules. He wants to go back to a time when the New Democratic Party as a government and its MLAs were able to operate above scrutiny, above accountability, and above common decency as well. We are not going to go back. We are going to go forward to a place of confidence where all of us know that we are protected in our workplace. I want it to be very, very clear that there is no place for harassment and bullying in this Legislative Assembly or in any workplace. There are not going to be two separate sets of rules. The rules will apply equally to everyone, and that means elected MLAs as well. Most certainly, every member of the government caucus knows that from my clear messages to them, and we have demonstrated the sincerity of this as a government caucus and team by taking action where action was recommended, by urging counseling where counseling was recommended, and by censure when censure was recommended. But now Mr. Canoe refuses to demonstrate personal leadership by refusing to hold his own caucus member accountable for this bullying behavior that he has been found to have exhibited. And in doing this, Mr. Canoe has doubled down on hiding from accountability. He is repeating past behavior. This government has strengthened workplace protections for public servants, and yet Mr. Canoe says that he has the back of the person found guilty of harassment, but not the backs of those who have become victims of harassment. To our civil servants, I say again, our government will have your back, and that is why we will review our respectful workplace policies, and if needed, we will make them even stronger. I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Premier. A reminder to our reporters on the line, you will have one preliminary and one follow-up question. Up first this afternoon from the Winnipeg Free Press, Carol.
Hi, Premier. What do you say to the opposition's allegation that Mr. Beauregard's complaint was directed by you to stop the opposition from asking uncomfortable questions or questions that your government doesn't want to answer?
That's a phony allegation, Carol. I'm happy to answer. As you well know, as I have always been, I'm happy to answer any question that you raise or that the opposition raises. It's a false allegation. And it's designed to discredit the process which we've put in place, which I'm told is leading among many provinces, most in fact, to move to a safer workplace for the people who work here.
Okay, and today Dr. Roussin announced that COVID-19 self-isolation requirements for people who in the past wouldn't have been considered close contacts. So is the province considering offering financial compensation to people if they lose hours at work, or offer any social supports like the delivery of essential goods to make sure they can stay at home? Anything over and above what the federal government has in place?
Carol, we've not taken anything off the table. As you know, we've introduced a number of programs, all of which combined are, we're told, more generous than any other jurisdiction in terms of their total value. Nonetheless, no amount of programs is going to make up for the sacrifices of Canadians during this pandemic, and we all know that. So I won't rule out any additional compensatory programs. As you know, I was part of a small group of premiers who initially advocated very strongly and successfully for the federal government to introduce some paid leave provisions to make sure that people were able, if they were missing work, to get some supports while they were waiting for their testing results and so on. So I wouldn't rule it out, Carol, entirely.
From Global News, Brittany.
Good afternoon, Premier Pallister, Brittany from Global News. The Prime Minister said today that we are expecting to get a big influx of COVID vaccine from Pfizer and Moderna this week. And I'm just wondering what conversations you've been having on the federal level about the vaccines and the expectancy of an increase in influx this week and in the coming weeks.
Yeah, sure. Well, none of us are happy, including the Prime Minister, about being, I think today we're 56th on the ranking of nations in terms of getting vaccines to our people. But the Prime Minister's assured all the premiers as of last Thursday, we had our most recent call, that we can prepare for a big influx, and we're all excited about that, obviously. Every jurisdiction, including Manitoba, has been gearing up and getting ready for this influx. And I know Manitobans will be excited to be able to get protected against this pandemic.
And as we start to look forward to public health orders expiring and looking towards new ones, how have you thought that this new reopening plan has been going based on what you've been seeing?
Well, it's interesting. We've had the best of times and the worst of times in the last week and a half when it comes to weather. I've seen such an incredible response from Manitobans throughout this pandemic, respecting and really respecting the sad necessity for us to do these things, to comply with our public health orders, has saved lives. Dr. Roussin has estimated hundreds and hundreds of lives have been saved by the actions of Manitobans behaving responsibly. And I hope and I expect to see that continue as we move forward. I won't speculate on the rule changes that may be coming. I do know this, though, that Manitobans will be the first people to do the right thing to protect one another.
From the Brandon Sun, Colin.
Good afternoon, Mr. Premier. Last week you were preparing to speak with your colleagues across the country and the Prime Minister about your vaccine plan. I was just wondering what the reception to your plan was at your meeting.
Well, first of all, it's not my plan. The plan to get domestic vaccine production beefed up is one we've talked about for quite a while. We've acted to line up potential production. We hope that we don't need it this year, but we do know that it would be better for Manitobans and for all Canadians to be able to depend on a more reliable supply of vaccines and a more reliable supply chain in the future than we've seen thus far. The Prime Minister and his government have already made an investment, a small investment in Providence, the company that we're contracting with, and a larger investment with the other company. There are only two in Canada that have this technology and are working actively to develop it in Quebec. So the response is, as I would anticipate, very optimistic and I think very supportive. Most of the premiers or their senior officials are involved in an interprovincial, I'll call it a task force, to investigate the possibilities of moving further on this. And again, no time like the present. As my old dad used to say, best time to plant a tree was 30 years ago, and the second best time is today. For us, it would have been good that we had these vaccines ready to use and disperse much sooner than is going to be the case, sadly, with this pandemic. But there's no time like the present to act on future pandemic possibilities, and the prevention of additional disease and the procreation of a future vaccine availability will help to prevent that. This is a time to act on that, so that's what we're doing.
How many other jurisdictions would you say are seriously interested in joining the Providence vaccine buy at this point?
Yeah, well, we're not trying to sell other provinces on doing what we've done. We're trying, with specific reference to the company we've chosen, they can choose any company they like. I think the idea here that's being explored by, I think, almost all the province's officials, and in partnership with the federal government, who's discussing this with us as well, is to see what we can do to beef up not only the research towards developing a vaccine, but the development, manufacturing, and distribution, so that we have the supply chain going forward. If not for the next pandemic, potentially for the booster shots that we'll very likely need in the coming year.
From the Winnipeg Sun, Josh.
Good afternoon, Mr. Premier. Looking for some clarification, I guess. When someone is censured through the Legislative Assemblies Act for bullying and harassment, what happens? Is it just a mark on their record? Are there other penalties that they can face, or does that fall further to their party caucus for determination? And what would you like to see happen in this case?
Well, as I referenced in my comments, we had 3 incidents of allegations that were brought earlier against members of the government caucus. In each case, the government caucus acted. They acted to make sure that there were appropriate penalties brought to bear so this wouldn't happen again. And that was the idea. Ultimately, when it did happen again, that particular individual did not receive permission to run for our party for office again. This, I think, demonstrates the seriousness with which we approach these things. Unfortunately, this doesn't appear to be the response of the opposition. In fact, quite the opposite. not just not willing to take action, but willing to have everyone sign something saying the process is flawed, when in fact the opposition was part of the process, watched it work when it was people outside of their caucus that were involved, but now protests it when it's someone inside their caucus. This means they're politicizing their response, and that's sad because it is clear from the independent arm's length analysis that this was harassment of the worst kind, discrediting a person of some integrity with repeated accusations knowing they were false. This is not how anyone would want to be treated. And I'd ask Manitobans to realize and ask themselves to consider for a second, what if someone made an accusation, a false accusation against you? What if they said that you were doing something that was disreputable? Or what if they accused you of doing something that was dishonest? How would you respond? That's a difficult thing, isn't it? And then imagine that this is reported in a newspaper again and again and again and again. How would that make you feel? How would that make your wife or your husband feel? How would that make your children feel? How would that make your mom and dad feel? This is what Mr. Beauregard has gone through for half a year. This isn't justifiable. People shouldn't make excuses about things like this. And if the NDP won't do that, it's a sad repetition of the way they approached the harassment that occurred in the previous government under their watch by a cabinet minister. They haven't learned a thing. So we'll look at beefing this up if need be, because it has to work. Because people deserve the right to work and not be harassed when they're working.
My second question, I'd like to follow up on something Carol asked about support for businesses. Said nothing's off the table, but I'm wondering what you would need to see happen for more support to come forward. Is the province waiting for lower case numbers so that for reopening you can have a plan of attack like you did last spring and summer with wage subsidy programs, or is there anything that you can see that would potentially be forthcoming for those businesses who are still not able to open, still don't have a time when they might be able to open, and are in another week having to make another rent payment with still no idea when they'll be able to open? What do you need to see for more support for some of these businesses to be forthcoming from the province?
Yeah, no, you've been on this issue, Josh, and good for you. Others have too, and I think it's really important to understand we've got some people that are really hurting. Our small business community has made major sacrifices, and they want us to make progress slowly and sustainably to get reopened. But that's taken time. We brought out a number of programs ourselves. We fought for better programs nationally from the federal government. Some of those have happened. Others were waiting for more detail from them. On our front, we've moved with, as I've said, some of the biggest capital programs that any province has come up with, but there's more that we're willing to do. We're working now with business advisors to design additional supports for recovery and support going forward. We came forward with a multi-million-dollar program to help our restaurant industry. We're looking at other programs of support as well. And over the next little while, we'll be making other announcements in respect of some additional supports. But I would say this, as my business friends tell me on a regular basis, we really don't want your supports. What we want to do is be able to be in business. And so that's what we're all hopeful about as soon as possible. And that's why following the workplace safety rules and respecting Dr. Roussen's recommendations is so critical as we move forward.
Thank you.
From CBC Manitoba, Ian.
Good afternoon, Mr. Premier. It took 1 week from the time Manitoba first reached out to Providence Therapeutics to a term sheet being signed. Is the 1 week enough time to do proper due diligence?
Due diligence didn't start a week ago, Ian. That was the time that we started finalizing the order. Our officials have told me that they were researching and looking at options for a significant number of weeks, and if not months. I think in terms of the specifics, though, you're right. In terms of the specifics of establishing the terms on the term sheet and that negotiation, I think that began, I believe it would have been a couple of weeks ago.
I guess what the understanding is, like, I guess from when Providence first reached out, it was a week from then to the term sheet being signed. What due diligence was conducted during that week?
Well, as I said to you just a minute ago, I think it depends. I suppose you're asking about research, I think, in terms of options. We had been, as a government, very aware very early that we couldn't count on necessarily, and this is not a disrespectful comment of the federal government, we couldn't, when the federal government promised us that we would get all our PPE from them and it wasn't forthcoming, we decided to take action very, very early on that, to work to look at other options. And I think quite successfully, with the partnership of a lot of Manitoba small businesses, we addressed that issue. So we took the same approach on vaccines. When the federal government said, we're going to get you all the vaccines you need, we said, okay, that's great, and did the common sense thing and started looking for other options. We reached out on a regular basis, systematically, to every vaccine manufacturer we could find. The major ones, of course, responded by saying, well, the federal government is our client now, and we're going to be working with them and not you. We then started looking at some smaller companies, and we also started last year looking at options in terms of additional research we could support, additional companies that were working in this area we could build relationships with. So that research began quite a while ago, I would say last year. We determined there were 2 companies that were advanced in their work on this messenger RNA technology that I will be challenged to explain. But nonetheless, the science that is necessary to develop vaccines. One of those companies is Providence, another one in Quebec, also fairly far advanced. Those companies have been researched by our people. We decided that we would enter in a dialogue with Providence, and that's what you're asking me about now.
From the Canadian Press, Steve.
Good afternoon, Premier. My question is about the province's casinos. As museums and other venues open up, and looking forward into the spring when some further relaxation might be allowed, according to the science, if the numbers stay low, has the province made a decision about reopening casinos, what the workforce might look like, what limited operations might be available?
Yeah, it's a good question, Steve. I'm going to answer it by just saying that there is work underway. There is dialogue underway between the health officials, representatives of our government, to assist, led by Deputy Premier Kelvin Gertson, that is going to investigate further possibilities, hypothetical possibilities on openings and strategies around them. This wouldn't be limited to just the small businesses that one of your colleagues just asked about, but this would be expanded to include things like government operations, the community events that so many of us miss, and those types of things. Going right into when can we look at having the Gold Eyes, the Bombers, and the Jets, and what's the strategy going to be around that? So this dialogue is underway, this discussion is underway, but I would emphasize it's premature at this stage to start talking about large group gatherings, and I think Dr. Roussin would back me up on this and say these large group gatherings are the ones that COVID would love us to start undertaking right away. I think it's premature because we're seeing variants emerge. Manitoba is at the back of the pack, and we'd like to stay there on variants coming into our province, but they are a real challenge. And especially because, as Dr. Tam has said repeatedly, they have the ability to multiply more rapidly and spread more quickly. And so we have to be very careful. So we're guarded, we're hopeful, we're looking at the options and strategies going forward, including issues like casino reopenings. Those things are on the table, but I don't want to create a false sense of optimism that we're in a rush to get these things going too quickly, because that's not the case.
Yeah, and health officials and yourself have talked about optimism, downplayed the possibility of large crowds. So given that we're looking at these large venues not being anywhere close to fully operational, not just in the short term, but the medium term, does that have implications for the provincial workforce in areas like casinos? And are there talks underway on that front?
Actually, there's dialogue on that as recently as this morning, Steve. Our workplace strategy has been to try to help people stay at work as much as possible In our province, we have been able to do that better than I think most. The last report we saw from issued by the Privy Council in Ottawa, not our agency, said that we are third in terms of impact on the public sector in the country. But we recognize that there are challenges there, and that's why we've offered supports not only for public sector workers, but also for our private sector business owners and private sector people as well, because it's all of us in this together, not one group against another, but all of us in this together. And so we'll continue to take the necessary steps to do what we can to protect our people. This is why I'm talking about, for example, our struggle to continue to reduce and hopefully to end harassment and bullying in the workplace today. These are important things, but of course we are also optimistic that with these vaccines coming in, we can help people get back to work in a safe working environment as soon as possible.
From CTV Winnipeg, Jeff.
Hi, Mr. Premier. I'd just like your reaction to the injunction being overturned with respect to the outlet channels project.
Yeah, you know, I'm pleased with that. Obviously, that allows us to continue to do some preparatory work to get ready. But the sad fact remains, Jeff, that in many ways we're no further ahead than we were 5 years ago. Every time that we deal with another federal delay and another Bay Street-generated court protest, we're just, you know, spinning our wheels when we should be protecting people against flooding. I'd like to get this project underway. We're talking about digging a ditch right now. 5 years in, trying to get a ditch dug to protect people, and we still get Bay Street lawyers wanting to cash checks while they delay the process. This isn't helpful. This is most unhelpful. So we're trying to get people back their security. We're trying to give them their lives back. Not just Indigenous people, non-Indigenous Métis people too. This is their homeland we're talking about, and it deserves to be protected. And they've been sacrificed for many years, and I think it's about time that we address this issue effectively together, and I have urged the federal government to do that with our government. And I thank the federal minister, Minister Wilkinson, for his willingness to communicate regularly with our minister, Minister Schuler in this instance. But, you know, talking regularly isn't getting anything dug. And we need to get going on this outlet. We need to get it going now before we have to pay another $2 billion for another flood. That's not going to help anybody be better off in this province or in this country.
You've spoken about this quite a bit, but from your point of view, what is the holdup? Is it environmental process? Feds asking you to do more consultation? What specifically are you saying is the holdup?
We're going to pull together examples so I can give you chapter and verse, Jeff, exactly what the principal cause of the delays is. It is exactly as you described. It's a process that has been so lengthened and beleaguered and deepened that one of my staff calls it the Medusa's Head project, because every time you answer a question, there are two more. And the fact is, the more questions we answer, the more questions we have to answer, and so on and so forth. It's becoming a real source of frustration, not only to the folks who live in that area who would like to have some security again in their lives, but rather it's a source of frustration, I think, even to some of the federal officials that are involved. So we have a process that is lengthy. It is getting longer rather than moving towards resolution, and that is not helping us to get this important project off the ground. You know, so winning an injunction battle in court is a temporary victory, but the larger issue is getting a ditch dug so that we can give some security to people in Manitoba.
From City News, Jonas.
Good afternoon, Mr. Premier. Just want to circle back on the issue involving Mr. Beauregard. I know this involves findings of bullying in the workplace, so I don't know what you can discuss. But what I would like you to discuss is the allegations that were leveled against Mr. Beauregard and your take on what actually happened.
What actually happened was Mr. Beauregard was doing his job. We didn't give a contract to Manitoba Hydro because it had already been awarded 10 years ago by the previous NDP government, untendered, to Bell, and it was extended because it was for electronic services to be offered. During COVID, we didn't think was the right time to go to the marketplace when we were in a state of flux on what we needed for services. Mr. Beauregard was doing his job, communicating the message that Cabinet the cabinet decision told him to communicate. He was doing his job, and he got criticized for it because he used to be at Bell. But the Conflict of Interest Commissioner declared that he was not in a state of conflict. The previous clerk of the Legislative Assembly has said there is zero indication that Mr. Beauregard did anything wrong. The Civil Service Commission of the province of Manitoba has said that he always acted appropriately. The only people that are attacking Mr. Beauregard are the NDP. So I don't think that makes the process that we used anything but the right thing to do. And the process was an arm's length, non-political analysis of the accusation that he was being harassed, which it is clear now the conclusion was he was being harassed. And so the NDP should act accordingly, censure the man who was doing the harassing, and stand up for people. Look, a couple of years ago, when it came to light that the previous NDP government was covering up harassment by one of their cabinet ministers, Mr. Canoe was the guy who said, political considerations, this is a quote now, political considerations were put ahead of doing the right thing, and that will change under my leadership. Apparently not. Apparently nothing new here. Apparently the same old thing, and that can't be. And Mr. Canoe goes further to say, how can a party that espouses that it stands up for vulnerable people instead allow people to be victimized and look away? Those are Mr. Canoe's words from 3 years ago. And now what is he doing? Allowing someone to be victimized and looking away. And worse than that, he's discrediting the very processes that we put in place to protect people here in Manitoba that others are looking to in other provinces right now to learn from and to adopt. Processes that keep the politics out of this. This is not a province under my leadership that's going to have two-tier protections. Everybody gets protected to one degree, but politicians get protected more. That isn't going to happen. So I'm encouraging the NDP and Mr. Canoe to change their position. This is not the time to put politics ahead of the safety of people who work in our government.
Appreciate that, sir. As the topic change on this one, we are, Dr. Roussin this afternoon was talking about expanded contact tracing and how critical this is going to be. Can you just maybe elaborate a little on the expansion that has gone on and just some of the focus that's been put on this as we do reopen and these variants are emerging?
I'm going to elaborate, Jonas, I'm sorry, but I'm going to elaborate on the more important point, I think, which is this. The ability that we've demonstrated here in Manitoba to reduce our number of contacts, as hard as that has been, that is the reason we are beating COVID right now. And that's hard. It's hard because we're social people. We'd like to be out and about. We'd like to be seeing a lot more of our friends and family, but it's a sacrifice that we're making right now. And I want to say thanks again to Manitobans for doing that, because when a contact number goes high, and COVID likes that, COVID can expand and rapidly, and that puts a tremendous burden on everybody, especially our healthcare system, not just the trackers, the tracers, the folks that do the follow-up. The contact tracing work would be a lot more onerous, but rather, most importantly, the hospitalizations and the actual deaths and the ICU needs and so on. So what we're doing as Manitobans is we're saying, let's just make a short-term sacrifice. I said, the start of the new year, I said we got 90 days of duty. Well, the end of March isn't quite here yet, so I'm still saying it. 90 days of duty. Remember, we've got to make some sacrifices now, and it's paying off because we're saving lives.
Our final reporter this afternoon, Mr. Premier, from CBC National News, Cameron.
Hi, Mr. Premier. Cam McIntosh from CBC here. Just want to ask you about COVID-19 immunization cards here in Manitoba. I know that process is being looked at. As for unintended consequences, do you have any concerns that perhaps an immunization card might be used to, say, deny someone access to somewhere or service to, or be used to deny service?
Yeah, I've become a little bit of an amateur researcher on this topic, Cam, and I know there's good and bad to it. The reality is, though, that there are some legitimate points, I think, of entry where people would need to prove that they are either vaccinated or, prove their status. For example, airlines, air travel is one of the areas where I think until we have some verification mechanisms, it's going to be very, very challenging to effectively open up our air travel to all travelers. I think some travelers would be very reluctant to travel by air, and you've just seen a national survey released that shows that that is the case unless there are additional safety measures brought in. We've had some discussion with our pro sports franchises, and that's another example where they understand that for large groups to be allowed, there's going to have to be some mechanism that assures never certainty, but a higher level of public safety. So it's a tough issue, and I never want to see individuals discriminated against on any basis. So there's a balance, and we'll have to be very careful as we discuss and as we review this balance. And we have had these discussions as well among premiers, and I think that it would be wise to have, and I've had this discussion actually last week with the governor of North Dakota as well, nationally, potentially internationally. We need to be very careful about the actions we take, and we should do them as much as possible in concert with one another.
Do you see legislation as perhaps part of that balance? I guess, part of what I'm asking here is getting on an airplane is one thing, packing a stadium is one thing, but say someone denying someone service in a coffee shop could be something a little different, right? So in trying to find that balance, is there a role for legislation, do you think?
Not sure about legislation, Cam. The issue you raise is really important. We've heard of reports early on, especially of truck drivers being discriminated against. I think CBC was familiar with this. I talked to Governor Burgum about this in North Dakota. We're both concerned that that not happen going forward, but there's a tricky thing evolving right now where we see the United States, in fact, North Dakota may have everybody vaccinated in the next few weeks, potentially. And Manitoba, it's going to be slower because the vaccines aren't available at the same pace as they are in the United States. What that could mean, potentially, is a repeat of what we saw in the spring with some coffee shops, even gas stations themselves, being reluctant to see truck drivers in their midst out of fear. And we don't want to see that happen in North Dakota because they're all vaccinated and our truck drivers are going down there trying to get goods to market or bring goods back to us. And, so you see where we're going here. So we've been discussing this already, North Dakota and Manitoba, looking for ways that we can address this issue. This is just the tip of the iceberg, though, on the potential dangers of not thinking through a uniform strategy. So we want everybody to be safe. We want, of course, as many people as possible that can safely take the vaccine to take it when it's available. We know we're working towards that, but it's the interim period between now and that day, that foreseeable but unforeseeable day, that is the issue that we have to accommodate in these next few weeks. I want to say thanks to everybody. This is an important issue. You know it's an important issue if you've followed the actions of my government, and to myself. We do not want to see people unsafe in the workplace. We believe that the system that we have established is one that is more than defensible. It can be very helpful to creating a safer workplace. That's why we've instituted better systems of transparency, regular reporting, and that's why we've instituted systems that put MLAs, elected members of our legislature, in the same category as everyone else, not in a separate category, in the same category as everyone else, obligated to respect each other, obligated to respect the safety and the well-being of everyone they work with. That's a goal worth pursuing. We're going to stay pursuing it.